Hello. So the next thing I want to talk about is the methodology behind Chin's paper, the methodology behind the Move to Opportunity paper. At first glance, the methods in this paper are very, very simple. Essentially, what Chin does is he treats the Move to Opportunity experience, he treats the demolition of public housing projects as if he was looking at an experiment. So what that means is, when he wants to know the effect of having your housing tower demolished on your adult outcomes, all he does is he compares the average outcome for children who lived in demolished houses to the average outcome for children who lived in houses that weren't demolished in the same housing unit, right? So if we think about the IDB Wells towers, comparing the people who lived in one of the towers that was demolished to the people who lived in the towers that weren't demolished. So in terms of the technical side of this is as simple as you can get. But this leads to the question, why is it that we can treat this as if it was an experiment when it wasn't? What I mean by this is, when we say that moving to opportunity is an experiment, we mean literally that whether you were in the treatment group that received the voucher or the control group that didn't receive the voucher was totally random, right? Somebody flipped a coin, or they spun a wheel, or they used some sort of random number generator or something actually random to decide which group you were going to be in. And as a result of that, we could feel confident that the people who ended up in the treatment group were no different from the people who ended up in the control group. But when we look at the demolition of public housing in Chicago, it doesn't look like this. Nobody flipped a coin and said, your unit is going to be demolished. Oh, tails, your unit is going to be saved. Right? Instead, what happened is the Chicago Housing Authority and the Federal Housing Authority made decisions about which towers to destroy and which towers to leave on the basis of things like maintenance issues. And so what that means is, in order to treat this as if it's an experiment, we need to make some pretty strong assumptions. And Chen lays out a case for why it is we're allowed to do this. Before I get too far into his case, I want to spend a minute reminding us of kind of the argument behind causality and why experiments give us causality. So as we've talked about, right, if I want to know for a particular person, right, if I want to know for myself what the effects would be of moving out of public housing, what I would want to do in an ideal world is I would compare myself in public housing to myself out of public housing, right? So we would say the real effect of leaving public housing for person I would be my outcome, right, my adult employment or my adult earnings, given that I did leave public housing, minus what I would have earned had I never left public housing, right? So, or if you want to think about it this way, my adult earnings if my housing unit was destroyed, minus my adult earnings if my housing unit was never destroyed. Now, in the real world, every empirical strategy that we can actually do is not going to compare two hypothetical states of the world, right? To do this, we would need some sort of a multiverse splitting device, use quantum fluctuations. That's the physics department job. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to estimate the effect by comparing me, who was in a unit that was destroyed, to somebody else whose unit was not destroyed, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to say our estimated effect is going to be my outcome, given that I was treated, right, that my unit was destroyed, minus your outcome, given that you weren't treated. Right, so person I's outcome, given that person I was treated, minus person J's outcome, given that person J was not treated. And we can take this and split this into two pieces, the true effect and the bias. So we can say this is going to equal this first chunk here, which is the real effect, plus the bias. Why is it we can do this? Well, mathematically, all we've done is subtracted y of I and t equals 0, right? My outcome if I hadn't had my unit destroyed, and then added y I t equals 0, right? So mathematically, we've just added and subtracted the same thing, so this and this are identical. What this means is, when I'm comparing me treated to you in the control, right, you not treated, what I'm effectively doing is I'm adding together the effect of my treatment and the ways in which we would have been different had I never been treated in the first place, right? The ways that we would have been different regardless of treatment. So the reason that this is going to be unbiased in an experiment, right? In an experiment, we're going to say that our intent to treat estimate, right, the effect of being put in the treatment group, is just going to equal the treatment average minus the control average, right? And the bias here is just going to be the average level of the outcome of every member of the treatment group had they never been treated, minus the average level of the outcome of the control group had they never been treated, right? So the bias is just going to be this, right? The difference between the treatment group, what the treatment group average would have been had the treatment group not gotten any treatment, and what the control average would have been had the control group not gotten any treatment. And we're going to believe that this is 0 in the case of an experiment, because since we assign people at random to the treatment and control group, on average, the two groups should really be identical, right? The only differences between the groups are going to be luck of the draw. So if we want to believe that the move to opportunity experience was an experiment or could be treated like an experiment, we need to believe that this is true in the move to opportunity experience, right? What we need to believe is that had it not been for the housing demolition, the people who lived in demolished houses would have had the exact same life outcomes as the people who lived in houses that were not demolished. In other words, what we really need to believe is it's the same type of people who lived in houses that were demolished and who lived in houses that were not demolished. Now, to make this argument, Chin is going to say two things. So the first thing that Chin is going to argue is that because of the fact that there was never enough space in Chicago public housing, people essentially had to take the first unit of housing that they were offered. In other words, if we think of there being an applicant pool that contains some people who are relatively more advantaged, who have made blue stars here, and some people who are relatively less advantaged, who are orange lightning bolts. What we're going to say is, when your number comes up, right, which house you're going to be assigned to has nothing to do with you. Essentially, just once it's your turn to be assigned to a unit of housing, whatever the next unit is available is the one that you get. There's really no arguing. If you say no to that unit of housing, you go back to the back of the line, and you're unlikely to ever get an offer again. Right? And so what this means is, if we think about your likelihood of ending up in each of 3 housing projects, right, where in this case the kind of green soft rectangle, yellow circle, and black rectangle, your likelihood of ending up in one of these projects, one of these towers, is not really going to depend on who you are. Right? So you're just as likely to be assigned to each of these if you're relatively advantaged, the stars, or relatively disadvantaged, the lightning bolts. Right? So essentially what he's saying is we've got random assignment to these towers. Now, what he doesn't say, but is important to point out, is that even if that's true, even if we have random assignment to these towers, we need something a little bit more to be able to say that we still have a random assortment of families living in those towers at the time that the decision is made to destroy the towers or not. And the reason for this is, we might imagine that even if it's random which tower you're assigned, right? So if the group of people who are offered space in each of these 3 towers looks exactly the same, let's imagine that this green soft rectangle is really, really bad, right? The yellow circle is in better repair, and this black rectangle is in excellent repair, right? Let's imagine that there's differences in these towers and how desirable they are. What you might worry about is that if you're a relatively advantaged family that is offered a spot in the worst housing project, you might, first of all, be less likely to accept that spot, right? You might be more likely to say, actually, I'm not going to move into public housing. I'm going to figure something else out. And you might be more likely to leave earlier than you would have if you had been assigned to a better piece of public housing. So over time, even if the group of families moving into these housing units looks exactly the same, or at least the group of families being offered these housing units looks exactly the same, the group actually present in the worst maintained housing unit might be more disadvantaged than the group actually present in the best housing unit, right? In other words, these two, the more advantaged people who were in this green one have left. Some of the more advantaged people in the mediocre one have left. None of the advantaged people in the best one have left, right? So because of differential attrition, by the time the housing units are being destroyed, they might look very different in terms of the kind of residents living in them. Now, the second part of Chin's argument that partially deals with this is that the choice of which buildings to demolish does not have to do with who was living in the buildings or what the social situation looked like inside those buildings. And I want to explain why this is such an important argument. So let's imagine that we're talking about the Ida B. Wells projects, and we've got 6 housing towers, right? Indicated by these 6 rectangles here. And for various reasons, whether for differential attrition or just random luck, some of them have relatively advantaged populations, right? Like this one is relatively advantaged, right? Some of them have relatively disadvantaged populations, like this one is relatively disadvantaged, right? Now, let's imagine that the way the housing authority decided to demolish houses was based on something like the crime rate. So in this case, the housing authority is going to say, let's demolish the highest crime units, and we might expect that the highest crime units are going to be the ones that have the most disadvantaged population, right? So this one gets demolished, this one gets demolished, and this one gets demolished. Then Chin comes in and he says, let's compare the life outcomes of the families that were in housing units that were demolished to the families that were in housing units that were not demolished. And what you can see is if we take all of these people in demolished housing and call them treated, and we take all the people in the housing units that weren't demolished and call them control, the treated group and the control group are going to look really different from each other, right? We're going to have way more disadvantaged people, way more lightning bolts in the treated group than we will in the control group. And so as a result, if we compare these two groups, right, we compare the children in these families, the treated families here to the children in the control families here, what we're going to expect to see is if moving out of public housing had no effect at all, if we just want to think about this bias term, there's going to be a strong negative bias, right? Essentially what we're going to say is the treatment group would have been worse off than the control group in the absence of any real effect. In contrast, let's imagine that the housing units were demolished for reasons that had nothing whatsoever to do with the people who were living in those housing units. So Chin makes the argument the reason some housing towers were demolished and other housing towers weren't demolished had nothing to do with crime or disorder or the maintenance of public spaces or anything like this that we might think is connected to the kind of people living in the housing towers, and had everything to do with things like burst water mains or major plumbing issues or broken furnaces or a lack of winterization. And you might think that these are the sorts of problems that grow over time, but that you're not very aware of as a resident until they become serious. So essentially the public housing project said, we're not going to do expensive repairs to fix any buildings. So once buildings start to break down, we're just going to knock them down. And in that case, in the best case scenario, right, if the sorts of repair problems that were driving those decisions did not affect who decided to stay or leave a housing project, we might find that, instead of demolishing the best housing or the worst of the housing towers, we demolish a random assortment of housing towers, right? So if we just happen to demolish these 3 chosen at random, we would end up with a group of treated residents who look a little bit more like the group of control residents. Now it's important to note though, they don't look exactly like the control residents, right? we're going to see that we've got more lightning bolts among the control group than we do among the treated group. And the reason that this might happen is because whereas in an ideal world, we would be randomly assigning people, right? So randomly assigning families to either move out of housing or not move out of housing. In this case, we're randomly assigning buildings. And because we have far fewer buildings than we have people, what this is going to mean is that we're going to have far more random variance between the treatment and control group than we would have if we were randomly assigning people, right? If we just so happened to choose a different 3 projects to destroy, we would have gotten a different mix of treated and control groups. And so that's going to be another thing that this approach is going to have to deal with. So what we've learned is that in order to use the methods that Chin uses, right, in order to treat the move to opportunity experience, right, the demolition of public housing as an experiment, Chin needs to make some very strong assumptions, right? He essentially needs to assume that the people who were in houses that were demolished would have looked exactly the same as the people in houses that were not demolished if not for that demolition. And his argument has 2 pieces. The first piece is that the people who initially moved into these projects looked exactly the same in the various towers because of the fact that they weren't given any choices about where they lived once they were assigned public housing. And the second being that the decision about which towers to demolish had nothing to do with who was living in them at the time. So even if some of these towers had begun to change through differential attrition over time, at the moment that they were destroyed, the relatively disadvantaged houses would have been no different from the relatively advantaged houses. So again, this is a hard thing to buy. And so in order to defend this assumption, what he does is he says, let's look at the people who were living in demolished houses and the people who were living in houses that weren't demolished before the demolition occurred and see how different they look. And what he argues is they don't look all that different. So this table here is showing us the characteristics of children and adults before the demolition in the buildings that weren't demolished, that's the control group means, and in the buildings that were, and the difference between the ones that were and were not demolished. So what we can see here, right, is that children are about the same age in the 2 sets of buildings. The parents look fairly similar, right? They're very, very similar in their likelihood of being employed. Essentially, 17.3% of control group parents were employed, as opposed to 17.9% of treatment group parents. Treatment group parents earn an average of $45 a year less, so very, very small differences in economic outcomes, right? Fairly small differences in propensity to be involved in crime between the treatment and control groups, and no larger differences than you'd expect from chance. And fairly similar outcomes for children in their school performance, right? So about 95% of the treatment group and 95% of the control group is still enrolled in school before the housing is demolished. Now, of course, it's worth pointing out, we're talking about young children here, so it would be weird if this was a fairly small number. And treatment and control group children are both well behind state averages in reading scores and math scores, and behind by a similar amount. So the treatment group looks like they're doing slightly better in school, but again, no bigger differences than you would expect from chance. One thing I do want to highlight, though, is that while Chin says that while the differences in arrests are also no bigger than you would expect from chance, they are substantively large. So what this means is that if you're in the control group, your likelihood of being involved in a violent crime, having been arrested for a violent crime, is about 2.8%. If you're in the treatment group, your likelihood is about 3.9%. So that means it's about 50% higher. And your likelihood of being involved in a property crime is 1.8% if you're in the control group, and 3.3% if you're in the treatment group. So almost twice as high. So there are some differences here that make us think, if we had more data about these families, it's possible that we would see differences. But it's important to note, to the extent that we are seeing differences here, the bias is likely to go in the direction of treatment group families, right? The families that were in projects that were demolished being worse off at baseline than were the families in projects that were not demolished. Okay, so the last thing I want to ask you before we move on from methodology is why it is, given the challenges we've talked about, that Chin doesn't just do a difference in difference estimation. We could imagine a strategy where we'd say, let's compare the difference between children in housing projects that were going to be demolished, who grew up before they were demolished, right, who turned 18 in, say, 1991, to the earnings of those children who grew up after they were demolished, right, who turned 18 in 1997 or 1998. And compare that change to the change in earnings for children in houses that weren't demolished, who turned 18 in 1991, and who turned 18 in 1997 or 1998. And what we would do, as we've done, for example, for the casino gaming money and Native American children, is we would say the change over time in the control group is going to be our indication of what the change over time would have been in the treatment group if not for the treatment, right? So we would say in a hypothetical world, we would have ended up here, and our total effect is going to be this. The problem with doing this in this context is that we don't know who the children were who turned 18 in the pre-period. All the data we have is some information about children who were living in the projects at the time they were demolished, when they were children, and then data about those same children when they were adults. So we don't know what the earnings would have been for each of these towers in the pre-period. Instead, the best we can do is add controls to our regression for the characteristics of children that we see when they're children. So what we can do is we can say something like adult earnings are going to be alpha plus beta times whether your housing was demolished, plus maybe some gamma, or I'll call this beta 1 and call this beta 2, times, for instance, whether you were ever arrested. As a child, right, before the housing was demolished. And what we would be doing by doing this is say, if beta 1 is telling us, how does our guess about your adult earnings change if we know that your housing was demolished? By adding a control, we're saying, how does our guess about your adult earnings change if we know your housing was demolished, if we already knew whether or not you'd been arrested before that housing demolition decision was made? And so to the extent that this gives a good indication of what your adult earnings would have been, it can partially fulfill the role that's played by a difference in difference. But to the extent that it's unable to do so, we're left having to rely on theory to tell us whether or not we think that this makes a good natural experiment. One last thing I'm going to leave on, and I think I've said this a couple of times, I'm not sure that I buy that this is an unbiased natural experiment, but to the extent that we think there should be bias, it's very likely to go in the direction of making moving out of public housing look worse than it actually is, rather than making moving out of public housing look better than it actually is. And because what Chin is going to find is that moving out of public housing was more beneficial than we would have otherwise thought, that's going to be less concerning than if he'd had the opposite direction of bias. All right, in the next video, we'll talk about those results.